Quibi shut down, and there's been a lot of press on them.
Hmm.
They gave back, it was about $350 million that they had in cash that they're going to give back to the investors. They're winding down everything. A lot of employees getting let go. And in general, the sentiment that I've read is that most employees absolutely loved working there. They really looked up to the leadership. I read a little bit about, some light growing pains of when Meg and Jeff started working together for the first time, some email threads that had come out. But in general, it seemed like a pretty well run operation from what I've read about it. It just seemed like a hypothesis that is reasonable from the standpoint of venture capital, from the standpoint of major production firms, and from the standpoint of those two founders, and a thesis that and business plan that, again, are reasonable, but just didn't work out.
Yeah, I think that some of the things that they assumed were incorrect, right? Not understanding and looking at from a competitive standpoint and marketing competition standpoint, they didn't feel like TV, Netflix, Hulu were their competition. They also didn't feel like Instagram, TikTok, and the social spheres were their competition because, Quibi was like, we're going to capture that content that people can capture on their phones in between times.
Yep.
But they didn't properly appreciate that even though that was their platform, they still have to compete with all these other YouTube exists,
Yeah. Yeah.
and understanding that you have to carve a niche. And I think they were hurt by their leadership a little bit, even though obviously Meg Whitman and Jeffrey Katzenberg are legends, right? As leaders, that lack of connectivity to where the market is today and how content is being driven today. Like I saw that they paid a whole bunch of like older talent, right, to come on their platform
Hmm.
versus going organic and also catering to some of these personalities that are they're famous on YouTube, that are
Yep.
famous on TikTok, and creating content around them that is going to engage the audience of people you're and consumer you're trying to reach.
Right.
That was definitely a major flaw. And then the final thing is I can't think of a show that you have to go to Quibi to watch, right? Like Netflix became famous because they had a series of shows that became really popular and people were telling other people they have to watch and people signed up. Like I know there are subscriptions that I have specifically. I'll subscribe specifically when I know a certain season of a show is coming on, you know?
Yeah.
So those there, it just goes to show that just because you have a bunch of money and you have all the tools to succeed, if your game plan doesn't take into account your competition properly and evaluate your position in the marketplace and attack that aggressively, the writing was on the wall that this was probably not going to work out.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think there's a couple things that missed. I remember going through it, and content wise, I just didn't find the content very
Was not
engaging.
yet.
Um, LeBron did a show on there, and it was just a documentary about his school that he funded. Which, I mean, good for him, but I don't want to watch that. Like,
Yeah.
I'm just not interested. And I look at like how Apple TV's done it with their
Yep.
original base of content, and the quality is just significantly higher in terms of how engaging it is, the quality of the shows, the thoughtfulness, the creativity. They're funny, they're engaging. Even the Greatness Code series on Apple TV,
Yeah.
excellent. And every episode, by the way, 9 minutes. It should have been on Quibi,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
it's like those pieces. I think the thesis was right. I think their market also could have been incorrect, because I think that Gen Z has a lot of what they need through
Yeah.
TikTok,
Yep.
Snapchat, and all those other platforms. But I think that Gen X and millennials are more in need of what Quibi services would have provided, but probably more from a news standpoint, where you can
Yeah.
get a 10-minute video update of what's going on in the world.
Yeah, it was just too big, too fast, and didn't properly evaluate the market
Yeah.
conditions or the consumer conditions that they were getting into. But I do think, you brought up a very good point earlier on is that, for every if you don't take the risk of a Quibi, because we can go through history and find many, many other things that have failed like Quibi has failed, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the media around it was like laughing or saying, "Look at this big failure. It's such a disappointment," and that creates a trigger. I think there's a lot more to be gained from evaluating both the strengths and weaknesses of the platform,
Yeah.
and seeing how you can get better. One question I had for you on it was, do you think we're getting to a point where there's just too many different streaming platforms? Because I can't even keep track anymore. There are shows I watch on Amazon Prime, there are shows I watch on Netflix, there are shows I watch on Apple TV. Now HBO Go, like the individual networks are creating their own things. Do you think that we're getting to a point that there's this big new thing that helped Netflix explode as a company, that now we're just too concentrated and too diluted? Or do you think there's really a space for as many platforms as people want to come up with?
So when they initially built the railroads or even the roads, there are only
Mhm.
a few major brands of cars.
Yep.
Now there's tons,
Mhm.
tons, new ones coming out every year. Why is that? The infrastructure is what takes time to build. With the internet, with media, even with media sharing, there was an IP advantage in being able to stream content. Now
Yep.
that IP advantage is gone, it's not hard to build these systems, it's not hard to code them, and there's plenty of people who have that talent. So
Mhm.
there's no more infrastructure building that needs to happen, which opens up a market to a tremendous amount of competition. And typically what happens as the market saturates is you start to find these tribes that people form into. So like Prime has certain types of original content. You know, Netflix has a certain style of
Yeah.
original content. Apple TV, a certain style of original content. Same with Disney. Each one has excellent shows and each one has terrible shows. And it's really the same thing we saw with TV channels. This is just how markets saturate, is that they turn into
Yeah.
areas with a lot of competition and each one holds their own um, unique customer base and community. So I don't think anything that we're seeing is not normal from the standpoint of market saturation, but I think that in general, the understanding of the general consumer as to how markets progress and really uh, I like to tie everything back to some sort of reason to know the information because you know nobody really cares how markets change, but this
Yeah.
is if you're buying stocks, this is a really, really good piece of information to know that whenever a new technology enters the market, infrastructure is the first thing that needs to get built. So it's great
Yeah.
to invest in infrastructure companies. Once the infrastructure is built, they're not going to grow as fast anymore, but they'll have tremendous amounts of value. That's great. And when you have that value, you can then start to invest in the players. It's the same thing we're seeing in esports, where people are investing in companies that do the finance side of esports, that do the infrastructure
Mhm.
side. And same thing in cannabis. People are investing in companies that help companies stay regulated and make sure that they're compliant, as opposed to investing in specific brands. And that's really the best way to think about how industries progress. So Quibi was, to your point, V, whenever you throw a lot of money at something and you don't build it organically, it's very, very hard to sustain.
Yep.
So that's one part of it is that pace can be very, very negative when it
Mhm.
comes to building and growing a company. At the same time, looking at the way that Meg and Jeff went into this, raising a couple $1 billion and throwing it into this aggressive of a content strategy, they were looking for either a grand slam or nothing. And
Yeah. That's true.
that's that all this money was raised pre-COVID, by the way.
Yeah.
So once COVID hit, the market actually leaned their way,
Yeah.
which would have indicated that this was a brilliant idea. But sometimes these ideas don't work. And you, as a regular person, I think what's challenging is seeing that much money, especially when the majority of this country is struggling paycheck to paycheck, to see that much money just get blown in
Yeah.
two
That's
seconds.
that's it just goes to show you.
Yeah, that's hard. But, I think at the same time, it was a good swing. That's just what happens. And buyer beware, right? Like everybody who put the money in knew the risks that they were getting into, but it was worth it for a proportionately or a disproportionately large return that they were hoping on. And they're going to make 10 of those bets, 100 of those bets over the next couple years. And, you know, some will hit.
One other question before we kind of move on here is where do you see the future of the traditional broadcast media, the cable networks that have been long standing? Now with all these new platforms coming on, you pretty much, can consume what you want versus buying a whole bunch of channels and content that you really don't need. Do you think that doomsday is coming soon for cable network operators and large networks?
I think it's just shifting. So if I'm cable network or news really channel operators, I'm buying all of the major Instagram pages that share my news or
Mhm.
share, if I'm ESPN, I'm buying the companies like Wave TV, which a friend of mine, Brian, runs, which is basically a bunch of Instagram pages that share relevant content for different sports. And they're very good at sharing news. They're very up to date, very similar to what Bleacher Report and Overtime are doing on social media. It's incredibly important to own those platforms because that's how the new generation perceives information. But that's just a part of running a news organization and understanding how technology changes. Your initial goal is the same, right? Getting information out to as many people as possible. But as demographics age, as the way news and information is transmitted changes, it's your responsibility to stay on top of that. And so I think we'll see who's smart. We'll see who's agile. We'll see who's smart. We'll see who's built innovative infrastructures and cultures and who has great leadership. And we'll see who doesn't as well.